With this, our first stakeholder plenary begins. For those of you who participate for the first time in a global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, this is an innovative and interactive format to allow an exchange among all stakeholders here in this room. We have a set of listed discussants to whom we will give the floor in sets of 3 or 2, and all of you here in this room are invited to take the floor to chime in, to share your perspectives, and to address the other stakeholders here in this room. Please raise your hand, and we will put you in the speaking queue, and the microphone will come to you when it's your turn. The speaking time, as you have seen and heard, is limited to 3 minutes for this format. We would like to ask you to respect this limit to the benefit of all. When you take the floor, please kindly stand up and tell us first your name and affiliation in the beginning. Well, I don't need to tell you that legal interdependence is a fact in the digital age. If we collectively want to preserve the cross-border nature of the Internet, the only realistic and pragmatic pathway is to handle legal interdependence, and that is through establishing legal interoperability between norms and actors. This is precisely what you came here to discuss at the third global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. The need for cooperation among governments, companies, civil society and other actors has never been greater, and the operational approaches documents with their concrete proposals for norms, criteria and mechanisms are a remarkable and encouraging testimony to what stakeholders from around the world can achieve together in focused and collaborative work. This session should allow not only to discuss how to best cope with legal interdependence on the Internet, but also allow to share your thoughts and ambitions for what you hope can be achieved tomorrow on the second day, or highlight specific elements that we should all collectively keep in mind when we go in the thematic meetings of our programs tomorrow. Let us build on this. With this, I would like to start the interventions, to give the floor to Paul NEMITZ, if we can have a microphone over there, who's the principal advisor of the European Commission's DG Just. He is a member of the Content and Jurisdiction Program, and I also take the opportunity to thank the European Commission once again for their institutional support and their support of the Global Status Report. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul, and congratulations first of all to the Secretariat for the excellent work. The European Commission is here with quite a number of people. There are some colleagues over here from DG Connect, and we also have colleagues here from DG Home, so on all the 3 working groups we will be represented. Let me say that since the last meeting of Internet and Jurisdiction, I think we have seen a return of the law on the Internet, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing because, yes, we want a global Internet, we want the freedom of the Internet, but we also want to maintain the rule of law, we want functioning democracies, and we want to deliver human rights. And I think we are here together, all of us who participate in this activity. We recognize that democracy and law have a role in determining what's happening on the Internet. And I think that is already, compared to last year, an important progress. I would hope that in the work before us, we can make further distinctions, we can become more specific. For example, make distinctions like the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights does it, with criteria such as laws which are necessary in a democratic society. There are some laws which are not necessary in a democratic society, and I would hope that in our work we are able to make this difference. And I think this is an important difference, because in the public-private partnership in this forum, I think we all have to learn that it cannot be an argument against laws which are made in democracies under the control of constitutional courts based on a catalogue of fundamental rights, that these laws could be, or maybe they are, abused by dictatorships. This argument means that no laws can be passed in democracies anymore because any law can be abused by dictatorship. So I would hope that together we can make progress in drawing lines between what is legitimate in terms of law regulating the internet and what is not legitimate. And I would think also in all three working groups, the work of inspiration for domestic laws and possibly also for future international agreements, and there of course we have to be patient, should progress with the necessary effort. So thank you very much and happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next discussant, Harlem Desir, the representative on freedom of the media of the OSCE, unfortunately cannot be here with us today. He is also a member of the Content and Jurisdiction Program, and I would like to give the floor to FRANE MAROEVIC, who's the director of the office at the OSCE. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Paul, and apologies on behalf of Mr. Desir, who unfortunately, as Paul said, could not be with us today. I'm the director of the office which deals with freedom of expression and freedom of the media in 57 OSCE participating states. And from our perspective, it is clear that most of our freedom of expression now is happening online, and this is why we need the focus on this issue. The internet has brought us much closer together than we ever thought possible to the vision of the Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, which gives everyone the right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, through any media of his or her choice. And I think this was extremely visionary, that we should remember that this is the focus of our human rights of freedom of expression. But as we heard earlier today, the internet is the core of our also business and communication, and has made our societies even much more connected in every way possible, for both good and for bad. We are now also interconnecting machines and creating complex algorithms which will inadvertently govern many aspects of our lives, and will make our discussions on interdependence and jurisdiction even more essential in this place. In stressing the interdependence of our societies, I'm not telling you anything new. I mean, we have been interdependent on each other since we started exchanging goods and services in prehistoric times. As Bertrand mentioned earlier, we've just been upgrading and upgrading to the challenge that we have today, how to deal with the interdependence of billions of people and even more billions of machines. Today, it's almost impossible not to be dependent. I think even North Korea has to cooperate with other countries. But this interdependence is fragile, and we can see clearly the danger of creating a chaotic and fragmented online space with different rules and different jurisdiction, and almost every decision on regulating the internet has a cross-border effect. Us who deal in an intergovernmental sector know it is very difficult to get common commitments by states, and we are also always very happy when we get common commitments by states to safeguard our rights and the internet. And we see this very much in the OSCE, where we have a number of shared commitments, but we see how quickly those shared commitments can be diluted when it comes to legislation and implementation. So I think we have to build on the excellent commitments that we have, but we have to find ways to make them practical. We also have to deal with the conversation that we are participating now today in many places on how to deal with the negative aspects of the internet, how to tackle crime, extremism, and so on. Yes, criminals are taking advantage of the interconnectivity, but also they've been doing it with every new tool that has been developed. And as Paul NEMITZ already mentioned, we need laws, we need regulations that are necessary. We need to make the internet a safe place, but also find ways to deal with disinformation, trolling, and other problems that we have. And states here have a very important and a key role, but without states and without the freedom of human rights, we will not live in safety of the internet. We need an internet governance that coexists on mutually reinforcing of safety and human rights. We need states to be not the only ones who are engaged in these issues. We need all of us here together, the academia, the civil society, international organizations, and global and international internet companies to help us create solutions, and we need innovative approaches, maybe the approaches by Dan's daughter of how to make internet governance and internet connectivity functioning in today's age. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I now give the floor to our next discussant, after that we give the floor to the Stakeholder Plenary, so please already start raising your hands so that we can note this. I would now like to give the floor to Thomas Schneider, who's the Ambassador and Director of International Affairs of the Swiss Federal Office of Communications and a member of the Continent Jurisdiction Program. You have the floor.
Thank you, and hello everybody. 15 to 20 years ago, my government plus others, we were fighting for the multi-stakeholder model to be accepted as a dialogue concept on internet, on information society, as it was called at that time. Then it was called internet governance. Now we tend to call it digital governance. We were convinced of this because, based on our experience, an open and inclusive dialogue is the basis for any intelligent and appropriate decision making. So Swiss government was not only hosting the World Summit on the Information Society, we were giving the first money to the IGF to make it fly. We were co-creating the EuroDIC, hosting the second conference, and supported a number of dialogues. Now, 20 years later, digitization has developed, globalization has developed, have grown together. We have a huge potential for transformation already happening, that will happening, which will create opportunities, which will create challenges, it will create winners and losers. Everything is interdependent with everything. It's getting very complicated, and people now say, it's enough of dialogue, we need action, it's time to act. At the same time, the multilateral system is blocked, is polarized, there's no agreement, things are not moving. On national level, at least in Europe, the traditional system of big top-down organized parties that have a definition power is eroding, which leads to instability, to fears, to transformations. So how should we act in a way, as a colleague from the Canadian government said, something like thoughtful and appropriate responses? How do we get to thoughtful and appropriate responses? We think that we do not need new big institutions, no one-size-fits-all solutions, but we need more flexible, pragmatic governance systems, governance models that are bringing the relevant actors together in a new spirit, in a new mindset, not necessarily as representatives of new institutions, so that we can move or add to an open and inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue the dimension of an open and inclusive multi-stakeholder cooperation and also policy making. I think it's time to move to that next level now. And this is in this spirit that Switzerland has also strongly supported the UN Secretary General's high-level panel and its work, because we hope that that will help us to also learn from the architecture of the internet, which is a network of networks, to also on the cooperation and policy level grow into a network of networks that are horizontal, much more than hierarchical, interdisciplinary, where the relevant people, the relevant experts, the relevant stakeholders find each other based on issues, based on interests, based on shared principles and shared values, and come up with pragmatical solutions that enable everybody to seize opportunities, to avoid risks, and leave no one behind. And for us, of course, the INJ network is one of the highlights of, or the examples of such a network that is able to bring people together and provide for solutions, work towards solutions. We have supported the INJ network since its very beginning, and we will continue to do so. And if you look at the documents that you have now produced, they already give some good outlines of what the problem was. We were there last year, the years before. Now we have the elements of what is done or can be done on the table. The next step may be to turn this into more specific guidelines on more specific cases, and also to extend the network to the ones that are not present. We still have a bias here of, let's say, Western European, American representatives, and if we manage to make this a little bit more inclusive, which of course also takes resources, then that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please, I remind you, you can now take the floor, raise your hand. We have a first intervention over there, and we will look out for who wants to speak next.
Hi there, thanks, thanks Paul.
Please stand up
yes,
if you wouldn't mind.
I will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jan Kleijsen. I'm Director of Information Society at the Council of Europe and a proud supporter also of the network. We spoke about human rights and the internet, and mention was made also about, of artificial intelligence, notably by our colleagues from UNESCO and the OECD. Artificial intelligence will increasingly govern our lives. It will also increasingly govern the internet. So Paul mentioned this morning at the supporters meeting that a possible additional work stream could be devoted to artificial intelligence. I think that's a very good idea. Artificial intelligence will have a huge impact on the way the internet is run. And this is why the 47 member states of the Council of Europe decided 2 weeks ago at a ministerial session to start work on a binding legal instrument on AI based on the ethical frameworks that already exist, that were prepared by the European Commission, prepared by the OECD, and UNESCO is very active on it. There is the Montreal Declaration, there are a number of initiatives. But we now have a mandate to work on a binding instrument, which is important for AI generally, but also very much, I would submit here for discussion for the way the internet is run. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there at this stage any other interventions from the floor on the topic of managing legal interdependence and your hopes for what we collectively want to achieve tomorrow here together? If not, over there, please.
Thank you, Paul. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. And our Estonian minister dropped a couple of points that really alerted me to want to respond to. I think it was aspirational when we heard that freedom of expression is the same everywhere and that illegal is always illegal. And I wish it were so. But the experience of some of the American internet platforms in dealing with other governments is very instructive on how cooperation is really not a dirty word anymore, as Bertrand said. A lot of you were there in France, in Paris in November, when President Macron talked about the need to embed and to interoperate closely with one of the platforms, Facebook, in the case of figuring out how to moderate speech that he thought was damaging to democracy. Well, many months later, that exercise is concluded. And I think it showed that when government officials just within France, not across border, but just within France, they had a lot of difficulty agreeing on what violated French law when they were looking at moderation decisions that they're asking platforms to make. I think that was a very constructive form of cooperation. It helped government to understand that there are very few cases that are black and white. Most are multiple shades of gray within the laws of one country, let alone the laws across borders. Those are the experiences of getting inside of the machine, as it were, and understanding when content comes up, whether identified by an algorithm or by a complaint, that those decisions will often involve shades of gray. If governments can take a greater involvement, they will learn more about the difficulty of implementing your laws, not only within your country, but across borders. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Is there someone else in the stakeholder plenary who wants to take the floor before we go back to the discussants? No. If this is not the case, it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Lee TUTHILL, who's the Counsellor for Trade and Services at the World Trade Organization. Lee, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Paul. I wanted to say that I'm very happy that the WTO is invited to speak here today. I've been following the activities since shortly before the Ottawa meeting. And I think what has struck me is that the internet and policy jurisdictions work is so very important. Cooperation is key. That's come up again and again. Interoperability and complementarity of laws and procedures is really paramount in this space. And first, I'd like to say I'm pleased that the INJ's work has demonstrated a really probably perhaps inadvertent but impressive consistency with some of the fundamental trade principles. Transparency, fairness, and predictability are among these. The various guidelines and the operational plans for the service providers and governments that are proposed by the INJ network are an example of how these principles can actually be put into practice. Second, the cornerstone of your work is really communication, coordination, and cooperation. These are essential, and in the past, the trade rules have relied on the premise that governments can purely implement them at the national level, and they will comply. In the digital economy, this is increasingly not the case. With the increase in cross-border activities in particular, it's led to an interdependence that is greater than ever before, and the greater potential for conflict in jurisdictional related areas. Third, arriving at common norms, criteria, and mechanisms, even where strict harmonization is probably not possible, maybe not desirable, as someone else has said, will contribute to fairness. These will also enhance the predictability, and ensuring that your norms and criteria and mechanisms are well known and understood by all parties is really what transparency is about. In our electronic commerce discussions at the WTO, we have seen some of the same issues you are looking at arise. This includes issues like intermediary liability, jurisdictional concerns, and the need for greater collaboration. Also of interest to the WTO is the expectation expressed in some of your reports that the mechanisms being discussed here this week could help minimize the use of solutions such as data localization, filtering, and blocking. This is consistent with the trade system's concern that in certain instances, such solutions could also be barriers to trade. We admittedly believe at WTO that trade is not of the highest priority, such as things like privacy, combating global crime, freedom of expression. But for this reason, WTO does have exceptions that can be used. And the final point I'd want to make is our exceptions actually recognize the importance of some concepts that are being used here, concepts such as proportionality, necessity, and the need for legitimate policy objectives. Thank you very much, and I look forward to this discussion over the next couple of days, and to joining IGF as well, for anyone here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there an additional intervention from the Stakeholder Plenary? Someone wants to take the floor? If not, well, if this is not the case, it is now my pleasure to give the floor to RAMAN SINGH CHIMA, who's the Global Policy Director of Access Now and a member of the Content and Jurisdiction Program. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Paul. The first thing that strikes me being here is that this isn't just a network, it's an ecosystem. And I think we're very grateful to the work that Bertrand, Paul, many others at the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, but all of you here as well, particularly those of you with the different working groups, have worked on to look at the legal interdependencies when it comes into the issues of the Internet. And I think the first thing we recognize, and I think one of the running themes here is the revenge of the lawyers, right? But we recognize that we have a system or ecosystem of legal interdependencies, and it needs improvement. It doesn't need construction necessarily. We have things already existing. As a technology lawyer, the one thing I often mention is don't say the word tabula rasa, don't say it's a blank slate. We have a range of things that exist. The challenge is what is there today in terms of interdependencies across countries, within countries, and across different subjects don't often work well together, or rather they're under strain. Strain is the common theme that we see when it comes to internet policy over the last 2 to 3 years. The other thing that we often see is that some of this requires careful study, and it sometimes, I think, puts pressure on us to think, let's come to a quick solution. Private international law is the reduction of conflict of law. It is the recognition of the fact that legal systems don't always agree, but you can work on that. But I think the challenge here very often for us is to do a little bit of a reality check. And previous speakers have alluded to that. The internet is mainstream today. It powers every single thing we do. But the reality also is the internet is one of the most empowering transformative technologies while also putting people under risk globally. And we sometimes need to do a check. The liberty I'm going to take is to take a story from my home, my ancestral country, and to mention a test that Mahatma Gandhi often used to put. It's there in government textbooks, and like any government textbook, you'll only appreciate this when you're an adult. And the talisman that Gandhi often used to put was, if you are suffering, if you're not able to make a decision, think about the most downtrodden, the most anguished person you've seen, the most perhaps at-risk person you've ever seen in your life, and imagine what your decision would do to him. What sort of transformation it might occur, but more importantly, will it result in, there's a Hindi word called Swaraj, meaning empowerment, independence. Will it truly provide that? Because that is what the internet's potential is. It doesn't always reach that. And that's a test I think all of us in this community need to do when looking at legal standards. We need to also remember the fact is we will not always agree. As I think Paul NEMITZ alluded to, democracies sometimes also don't come up with great standards. In fact, democracies are much more interesting than dictatorships or totalitarian states because they often come up sometimes with bad measures. And the entire point of democracy is you won't always be right. You may make a mistake, but we need to discuss that. That's something where I want to flag to many of you participating here that you will not necessarily come to agreement sometimes tomorrow and day after. That's a good thing. You'll identify things that you need to work on further. And that's something I think the network has recognized. I know that they're doing follow-up meetings, including at RightsCon, which our organization hosts. And I encourage you to remember, don't just talk to the lawyers, the politicians, the policy wonks in the room. I'm a lawyer and I'm a policy wonk, and I keep saying I learned from my technologist friends, my digital security support staff who talk to people who are actually at risk and understand what's taking place there. And I think what we also need to think about is what is the best standards, the sort of fantastic examples that are taking place nationally, and how can we transform and put them into international standards there. And the last thing I'll leave you with, as people alluded to, this is about the next billion people going onto the internet today. Remember, the internet you encounter today is not necessarily the same thing they're going to go through. And that is a decision we make. The sort of norms or standards we discuss, whether here, nationally, at international fora, in trade rules, or elsewhere, will shape that web browser experience or whatever they encounter on an everyday basis. So that's a little bit of a reality check for you.
Thank you very much, Raman. Just one remark on what Jan was mentioning regarding artificial intelligence. What is extremely interesting is to identify the diversity of types of problems that are attached to it. And even if you took the example of platforms, the issues regarding algorithmic tools used for detection of content, or the issues regarding algorithmic tools for the selection of feeds, the issues regarding the use of algorithmic tools for even other types of uses within those single types of operators are already bringing different types of questions. And I think it's really great, and we'll be happy to go in the direction of exploring how the work that is intended in UNESCO, in Council of Europe, and elsewhere can be put together or connected. I couldn't agree more with Steve regarding the importance of shades of gray. I have the habit of saying that it's not black and white, it's shades of blue, actually. It's in another dimension. And the challenges of context in the content part is an enormous issue connected again to the question of algorithmic tools. And finally, as Raman was going in this direction, I've mentioned in the past and in Ottawa the Kantian imperative, categoric imperative, the fact that if you're contemplating a particular action, trying to imagine how it would look like if everybody were copying it, which is also an element of response to what Paul NEMITZ was highlighting. This is an intellectual exercise that requires that people step back a little and just try to conceptualize what would happen if everybody were implementing exactly the same thing, and in particular, what if I were on the receiving end of what I'm asking, and vice versa. If this looks good, how can we help those solutions scale? It goes to the best example and best practices. And to finish on philosophy, there's a French philosopher called Blaise Pascal, who basically said, man is neither an angel nor a beast, but if you want to make man an angel, you actually produce a beast. And this goes to what Jan was saying. We should probably try to avoid the dream of a cyberspace as a Garden of Eden where no ill would happen. The internet has not changed human nature. It has given amazing tools to the best part of humanity. And yes, it is true that it has also given an incredible ease of access to some people who are on the wrong side of the track and are abusing it. So with these words, we're going to close this.